On the morning of February 18th, 1815, in the hill country above a village called Medamahanuwara, a king was handed over by his own people. He had ruled for 17 years. He had built a lake and a temple pavilion that still stand in the city of Kandy today. And now his own chiefs, the men who had once knelt before him in the audience hall, bound his hands and delivered him to a column of British soldiers waiting in the forest below. 17 days later, in the royal audience hall beside the Temple of the Sacred Tooth Relic, a document was signed that ended more than 2,000 years of continuous monarchy on the island of Ceylon. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. This is the story of what happened to that king, his queens, and the dynasty he left behind after the last independent kingdom in Sri Lanka fell. A family carried off into a foreign fortress, a crown that spent more than a century locked away in London, and descendants who ended up scattered across a country their own ancestor never chose to call home, their royal titles reduced, within a single generation, to nothing more than a surname carried quietly through the villages of South India. To understand how a monarchy that old could collapse in a single dry season, you have to go back further, to a kingdom that had already survived what almost nothing else in South Asia had. The lowlands of Ceylon fell first, to the Portuguese in the 16th century, then to the Dutch in the 17th, each new power inheriting the coastal forts and the cinnamon trade of the one before it. But the interior of the island, the mountainous heart centered on Kandy, held out through all of it. Its approaches ran through dense jungle and steep, narrow passes that an invading army unfamiliar with the terrain could not easily survive, and its kings understood that geography, more than any treaty or army, was the wall protecting their throne. For 2.5 centuries, while European flags rose and fell over Colombo and Gale, the kingdom of Kandy remained the last unconquered Sinhalese state on the island, a Buddhist polity whose kings traced their office back to the ancient capitals of Anuradhapura and Polonnaruwa, a lineage older than most of the crowns of Europe. But by the middle of the 18th century, the family sitting on that throne had already changed. In 1739, King Veera Narendra Singha died without an heir by his Sinhalese queens. On his deathbed, following a custom that allowed the crown to pass through a wife's family, he nominated his queen's brother, a prince from the Nayakkar family of Madurai in South India, to succeed him. That prince became Sri Vijaya Rajasingha, and with his coronation began something unusual in the political history of the island, a line of Telugu-speaking, originally Hindu monarchs ruling over an overwhelmingly Sinhalese Buddhist kingdom. The Nayakkars adapted with real skill. They rebuilt and expanded the Temple of the Tooth, patronized the Buddhist monastic orders, and presided over what many historians consider one of the great late flowerings of Kandyan art, architecture, and religious life. They were foreign kings who made themselves custodians of a culture that was not originally their own, and for 2 more generations after Veera Narendra Singha's death, the arrangement held together reasonably well. The court they presided over was genuinely magnificent, even as the kingdom around it shrank in real power. The royal palace complex in Kandy sat beside an artificial lake and the octagonal pavilion that Sri Vikrama Rajasingha himself would later add, a structure built specifically so the king could watch the annual procession of the Sacred Tooth Relic without descending among the crowds. Foreign visitors who managed to reach the interior in the 18th century wrote home describing a court built around elaborate ceremony, painted temple walls, drummers and dancers attached to the royal household, and an administrative aristocracy of Adhikarams and Dasavas who governed the outlying provinces in the king's name. It was, by any regional standard, a wealthy and sophisticated capital, and almost nobody living inside it in the 1790s expected that within a generation it would cease to exist as an independent state at all. It began to come apart with the last of them. Sri Vikrama Rajasingha was born around 1780, most likely in Madurai, and was originally named Kannasamy. He was the son of a sister of the reigning queen, Upendrama, which made his claim to the throne real, but not the strongest one available. When King Rajati Rajasingha died in 1798 without children, the kingdom's most powerful minister, the first Adhikaram Pili Matalawe, engineered the succession of the 18-year-old Kannasamy over rival candidates with more direct royal blood. Pili Matalawe seems to have expected a pliant boy king he could control from behind the throne while quietly consolidating his own power over the kingdom's chiefs and revenues. What he got was not entirely pliant. The young man crowned as Sri Vikrama Rajasingha grew into a ruler determined to actually govern, and the tension between an ambitious first minister and a monarch unwilling to be managed would shape the first decade of the reign, long before the British ever became the more urgent problem. The British, meanwhile, were consolidating everything the Dutch had once held on the coast. Those maritime provinces, seized during the wars against revolutionary and Napoleonic France, were placed directly under the British Crown as a colony in 1802, administered from London rather than through a trading company, which made Ceylon a somewhat unusual case among Britain's Asian possessions. By the early years of the 19th century, Kandy stood as the last piece of the island, not under some form of European administration. Two early attempts to finish the conquest by force failed outright. In 1803, a British expedition under Major General Hay McDowell marched into the city of Kandy itself and briefly occupied the empty capital, only to find the king and his court had simply withdrawn into the surrounding hills with the harvest and the livestock, leaving nothing behind to sustain an occupying garrison. Within weeks, disease and starvation had gutted the British force. The retreat that followed collapsed into a rout, with much of the remaining garrison massacred in the passes on the way back to the coast, a disaster so severe it entered British military memory as one of the worst reversals its forces suffered anywhere in Asia. For roughly a decade after that campaign, an uneasy and watchful standoff held between the Mountain Kingdom and the colonial territory that now surrounded it on every side, while the British colonial secretary in Kandy, a quiet, Sinhala-speaking official named John D'Oyly, spent years privately cultivating relationships with disaffected chiefs, long before a single soldier crossed the border. What finally broke that standoff was not British artillery, it was the king's own aristocracy. Sri Vikrama Rajasinghe, increasingly isolated at court and increasingly convinced that his chiefs were plotting to depose or assassinate him, responded to real and imagined conspiracies with punishments that grew steadily more severe, including executions, mutilations, and the wholesale confiscation of noble estates. These measures alienated the very class of Kandyan aristocrats whose cooperation had sustained the monarchy for generations. Chief among his enemies was Ehelepola Nilame, a senior Adhikaram whose family the king had punished with extraordinary savagery after suspecting Ehelepola of disloyalty, an episode that included the execution of Ehelepola's wife and young children in the palace precincts, a horror that Kandyan oral tradition still recounts in grim detail 2 centuries later. Ehelepola fled to British protection in Colombo and became, in effect, the chief architect of the invasion that followed, supplying the colonial administration with intelligence, local knowledge, and the assurance the British needed most, that the Kandyan chiefs themselves would not fight to save their king. Governor Sir Robert Brownrigg needed only a formal pretext to move, and the king obligingly supplied one late in 1814, when a group of native traders holding British citizenship were seized on his orders and mutilated, an act Brownrigg's proclamation of war in January 1815 cited directly, framing the coming invasion not as a conquest of the Kandyan nation, but as a rescue of it from a ruler the proclamation called an object of abhorrence to mankind. When roughly 3,000 British and Ceylonese troops finally advanced into the hill country that month, they came at the invitation and with the active cooperation of the very nobles, among them the powerful first Adigar Muligoda, who had once been that king's court. He tried to run. For several days after the British column entered the capital, Sri Vikrama Rajasinghe moved through the surrounding forests with a small circle of loyalists, hoping to rally support in the outer provinces or simply to stay ahead of capture. Neither happened. On the 18th of February 1815, his own attendants delivered him into British hands near the village of Medamahanuwara, reportedly binding him before the handover, a final and deliberate humiliation carried out not by a foreign enemy, but by the men whose entire office existed to protect him. He was 34 years old, and the kingdom his family had ruled since 1739 effectively ended in that clearing in the forest, weeks before any document made it official. What followed moved with the brisk efficiency of men who had already decided the outcome among themselves. On the 2nd of March 1815, in the Magul Madua, the royal audience hall standing beside the Temple of the Tooth, a document known to history as the Kandyan Convention was signed by British officials and the chiefs who had just helped remove their own sovereign. The convention formally deposed Sri Vikrama Rajasinghe, declared the office of King of Kandy abolished forever, and transferred sovereignty over the interior provinces to the British Crown. It was written up as an agreement negotiated between the Kandyan chiefs and the colonial power, one that guaranteed the protection of Buddhism and preserved many of the customary privileges of the aristocracy who had just betrayed their king to secure exactly that outcome. In substance, it was the death certificate of the Sinhalese monarchy, a royal institution that in one form or another had governed parts of the island for well over 2,000 years, ended in a single afternoon inside the very hall built to receive foreign envoys paying homage to that same throne. The peace the chiefs had bargained for did not last. Within 2 years, heavy taxation, disrespect shown toward Buddhist religious sites by colonial officials, and the visible erosion of the promises made in the convention pushed the southeastern provinces of Uva and Wellasa into open revolt. What became known as the Great Rebellion of 1817 to 1818 drew in disaffected chiefs, Buddhist monks, and a pretender who claimed descent from the old royal line, and it took Governor Brownrigg's forces, reinforced by fresh troops brought in from India and eventually placed under martial law, nearly 2 years of brutal counterinsurgency to finally suppress. British columns burned granaries, destroyed crops, and slaughtered livestock across the Uva Highlands in a deliberate campaign to starve the rebellion into submission, a scorched earth strategy that devastated the region for a generation. Leaders of that resistance who were captured rather than killed were not simply imprisoned on the island. Several were exiled even farther than the old king had been, transported across the ocean to the British colony of Mauritius, a second wave of Kandyan nobility scattered into distant exile within just a few years of the first. The lesson the British drew from the uprising was straightforward, and it shaped how they governed the interior for the rest of the century. The old aristocracy, useful enough as an instrument for removing the king, could not be trusted with anything resembling real autonomy afterward either. The Regalia went the way of the kingdom. Personal possessions belonging to Sri Vikrama Rajasinha, including his state crown, his ceremonial sword and sword belt, his scepter, and a substantial quantity of royal jewelry, were seized by the British officers who took custody of him. Even the queens were not spared the plunder in the chaos of the capture. Contemporary accounts describe earrings being physically torn from their ears by soldiers moving quickly to strip the royal household of anything of value. Some of this treasure eventually crossed the ocean to London, where a portion was sold at public auction in the rooms of an auctioneer named Thomas King in 1820, scattering pieces of a 2,000-year-old royal inheritance into private British households within 5 years of the conquest that produced them. The family that lost all of this was a large one. Sri Vikrama Rajasinha had married several times, and historical genealogies record 2 principal queens who would follow him into exile, along with additional consorts and a number of children, including a son remembered as Rajadi Rajasingha, and daughters recorded under names such as Raja Lechumi, Raja Nachiyar, Sinhala Gauri, and Rajaratne Kamsalya. It was this entire household, not merely the king alone, that the British had to decide what to do with once the conquest was complete, and it was this entire household, wives, children, and attendants together, that would ultimately be marched onto a ship and carried out of the country their family had ruled for 3/4 of a century. The king himself was taken first to Colombo, along with his family. There the colonial administration installed them in a large house specially fitted out to accommodate a royal household, and for nearly a year they lived inside it in a strange, suspended kind of comfort, no longer sovereigns in any functioning sense, not yet prisoners in the fullest sense either, waiting for a decision that had almost certainly already been made in private. The reasoning behind that decision, once it came, was straightforward and cold. A deposed king left anywhere on the island, even under close guard, remained a possible rallying point for the resistance that had already begun flaring in parts of the interior. The safest king, from the point of view of the colonial administration in Colombo, was one who was very far away, and India, governed separately by the East India Company, offered a convenient jurisdiction outside Ceylon's own borders, where a king with no remaining subjects could be kept indefinitely. On the 24th of January 1816, Sri Vikrama Rajasinha was placed aboard a ship named the Cornwallis and sent across the Palk Strait toward the Indian mainland. He did not travel alone. Somewhere in the range of 100 relatives, dependents, and household servants accompanied him into exile, an entire displaced court being relocated wholesale to a foreign fortress hundreds of miles from home. His destination was Vellore, in what is now the state of Tamil Nadu, a name that already carried its own dark associations for anyone paying attention to recent company history. Vellore Fort had, only a few years earlier, held the surviving sons of Tipu Sultan, the deposed rulers of Mysore, whom the British had likewise judged too dangerous to leave anywhere near their former kingdom. The fort had, in effect, become the East India Company's holding pen for the monarchs it had personally unthroned across southern Asia, a granite waiting room for kings with nowhere left to reign. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. Life inside Vellore Fort settled into something between captivity and pension. The fort itself was an enormous, moated structure built originally by a local Vijayanagara chieftain in the 16th century, its granite ramparts already carrying 2.5 centuries of siege and occupation history before the Kandyan royal family ever arrived within its walls. Sri Vikrama Rajasinha lived there with his 2 principal queens and the extended household that had followed him from Kandy, supported by a modest allowance from the colonial government, guarded, closely watched, and slowly forgotten by the wider world outside the fort's high walls. Little of the day-to-day texture of that exile survives in detail today. What does survive suggests a man who never fully accepted what had happened to him. Colonial administrative records from the period describe him continuing to expect the courtesies of royal address inside his own quarters, still referring to himself, apparently without irony, as the King of Kandy, decades after the office had been formally abolished by the very power now paying his allowance. There were periodic rumors reaching British ears of plots to restore him, whispers among the exiled household of escape or rebellion, carried back to Ceylon through traders and pilgrims, though nothing ever came close to materializing into anything real. A captive court, cut off from its country, its language, and its temples, does not easily organize a rebellion from inside a colonial garrison town. The years in Vellore were not kind to him physically. By the early 1830s, in his early 50s, he had developed dropsy, the swelling condition now generally understood as a symptom of heart or kidney failure, and his health declined steadily through the closing months of 1831. British officers stationed at the fort noted the deterioration in their correspondence, describing a once formidable monarch reduced to a frail, swollen figure confined largely to his rooms. On the 30th of January 1832, Sri Vikrama Rajasinha died inside Vellore Fort, 17 years almost to the season after his capture in the forests above Medamahanuwara. He was buried in India, thousands of miles from the temple he had built, from the lake that still carries his name through the city of Kandy, from the audience hall where his kingdom had been legally dissolved out from under him while he was still, technically, alive to protest it, though no one had asked for his protest by then. With his death, the Nayakkar dynasty ended, and with it ended the last continuous line of monarchy Sri Lanka had ever known, a line stretching back, by the reckoning of the island's own chronicles, well over 2 millennia. News of the death took weeks to reach Colombo, and longer still to filter through the villages of the old Kandyan provinces, where the memory of a living, breathing king, however distant and however diminished, had lingered in ways the colonial government found genuinely difficult to extinguish. For years after 1815, British administrators in the hill country continued to report rumors moving through the bazaars that the king would return, that a ship was already on its way, that the whole exile had been a temporary humiliation rather than a permanent end. Sri Vikrama Rajasinha's death in a fortress bedroom in southern India, unwitnessed by almost anyone who had once served him, closed that particular door for good, though it would take colonial officials in Ceylon a while longer to fully believe it. He was not the end of the story, only the end of the reign. His queens outlived him inside the fort for years afterward, continuing to draw the same modest colonial allowance that had supported the household during his lifetime, raising the surviving children in a language and a landscape that were not the ones they had been born to expect as royalty. That pension did not stop with the immediate family either. Extraordinarily, the British colonial government, and later its administrative successors, continued paying an allowance to descendants of the exiled royal household for well over a century. According to Sri Lankan historical sources, that payment ran for 133 years, beginning with the king's deposition in 1815 and continuing until Ceylon's independence in 1948, at which point the newly sovereign government finally ended it. It is a strange kind of afterlife for a fallen monarchy, a family kept quietly on the ledgers of the very institution that had destroyed their kingdom, drawing a colonial stipend generation after generation in a garrison town in South India, long after almost anyone outside the family remembered exactly why the payments existed in the first place. The descendants themselves scattered across South India in the decades that followed, intermarrying into local families, settling permanently, and gradually losing whatever direct political connection they once had to the island their ancestor had governed. Genealogical accounts collected more recently by Sri Lankan researchers describe branches of the family living on in Tamil Nadu and in Andhra Pradesh, some still attaching the honorific Raja to their names, a title with no legal standing left anywhere and no kingdom behind it, carried forward regardless as a quiet marker of where the family had once come from. One such descendant, identified in family records as a great-great-grandson of the earlier king Rajati Rajasinha, was still being written about in the district of Chittoor as recently as the early 2000s. A private citizen with an ordinary life who nonetheless carried, several generations removed, the bloodline of a throne that no longer existed anywhere on earth. In the 20th century, the government of newly independent Ceylon made a small gesture toward reconnecting with this scattered lineage. Two grandsons of Sri Vikrama Rajasinha, known as KG Yogananda Raja and KG Suku Raja, were invited to return and settle permanently in Sri Lanka, with the promise of employment fitting for descendants of the old royal house. One of them took a position in the foreign exchange section of the Central Bank of Ceylon, a quiet, almost bureaucratic footnote to a family story that had begun on a royal throne in the mountains, passed through a colonial prison fortress in South India, and came to rest, for at least one branch of the bloodline, behind a desk in a government office building in Colombo. The Regalia had its own long journey home, separate from the family and arguably better documented. For more than a century after the conquest, the crown, sword, throne, and footstool of the Kandyan kings remained in England. Some pieces held in private hands after the 1820 auction dispersed them, others retained more formally as the accumulated spoils of a completed colonial conquest. Sri Lankan campaigners never entirely let the matter drop. The Ceylon Daily News raised the question publicly as early as 1924, and in November of 1933, the Ceylonese politician George E. de Silva moved a resolution in the State Council of Ceylon formally requesting the return of the crown and throne from Britain. That resolution passed in February of 1934. Later the same year, with the personal agreement of King George V, the Regalia were repatriated to the island during a royal tour by the Duke of Gloucester, arriving home more than a century after they had been carried away from a defeated king's palace by the men who deposed him. They went on to feature prominently in the ceremonies marking Ceylon's independence in 1948, the throne and crown of a dynasty the British had personally ended standing on public display at the birth of the very nation that dynasty's fall had eventually helped make possible. Today they remain in the National Museum in Colombo, a short walk from the government buildings of a country the Nayakkar kings never lived to see become independent, displayed now under museum glass alongside explanatory placards that most visitors read for a minute or two before moving on to the next case. Not everything made it back, and not everything that made it back stayed together. Some pieces of the original Regalia were never recovered from the 1820 London auction at all, and remain, if they survive, somewhere in private collections whose current owners may not even know the full history of what they hold. Sri Lankan researchers who have gone looking through British archival and museum records in more recent years have occasionally turned up individual objects, a ceremonial weapon here, a piece of jewelry there, whose documented provenance traces directly back to the plunder of 1815, artifacts still sitting in institutions thousands of miles from the temple complex they were taken from, their Sri Lankan origins noted in a catalogue entry but rarely dwelt upon. Vellore Fort still stands as well, a granite structure rising out of the middle of a busy South Indian city, its moat mostly dry now, its walls long since absorbed into the ordinary geography of a place with its own long history that has little to do with Sri Lanka specifically. Most visitors who pass through its gates today are there for reasons that have nothing to do with a Sinhalese king who died quietly inside it in 1832. There is no grand shrine to Sri Vikrama Rajasinha built into the fort, no equivalent of the pilgrimage sites that grew up around some other exiled monarchs of the same colonial period elsewhere in Asia. His grave and the precise circumstances of his burial have received far less public attention over the years than the fate of his crown, and that imbalance is its own kind of quiet commentary on which fragments of a fallen kingdom, a colonial power, and later the post-colonial state that succeeded it, chose to actively preserve, and which fragments were simply allowed to fade. What makes this story different from the fall of so many other monarchies of the period is not the brutality of the conquest, although it was brutal enough by any measure, and not the length of the exile, although 17 years confined inside a foreign fortress is its own quiet, grinding tragedy that rarely gets told in full. It is the particular manner of the fall itself. Sri Vikrama Rajasinha was not defeated primarily by British cannon or British numbers, which were not especially overwhelming in early 1815. He was handed over by the men who owed him their loyalty, delivered by his own chiefs into the hands of the colonial power those chiefs had calculated, correctly as it turned out, would serve their own interests far better than their king ever had. The convention that formally ended the monarchy was not simply imposed on Kandy from outside, it was negotiated and signed by Kandyans themselves, protecting their own noble privileges and their own beloved temple, while formally erasing forever the very throne that had once stood above every one of them. The most powerful office in the island's political history did not fall to a foreign army storming the gates. It fell because the aristocracy, built specifically to protect that office, decided, in a single moment of crisis, that protecting themselves mattered rather more. And there is something else in this story worth sitting with a while longer. 2,300 years, by the reckoning of the island's own royal chronicles, is an almost incomprehensible span of continuous monarchical tradition, longer than the Roman Empire lasted in any of its forms, longer than most single dynasties anywhere in recorded political history. And it ended not in some final climactic battle, not with a monarch dying gloriously in defense of his capital city, but with a frightened 34-year-old man being bound in a forest clearing by his own attendants and quietly handed over to a colonial power he had spent his entire adult reign failing to outmaneuver. He spent the rest of his life inside a fortress in a country that was never his own, insisting, to almost nobody left who was still listening, that he remained the rightful king. His queens grew old there on a British pension. His grandsons eventually ended up filing paperwork inside a bank in Colombo, a city their grandfather had once passed through only as a prisoner on his way into exile. His crown sat in a glass case in London for over a century before a resolution debated in a colonial parliament finally brought it home to a museum in the capital of a country he never got to see become independent, where it remains today, admired now mostly by tourists and schoolchildren who have little particular reason to think about the man who once wore it, running, in the last free days of his reign, from the collapse of absolutely everything he had. 2 centuries later, the mountains above Medamahanuwara are quiet again, farmed and forested, with almost nothing left to mark the exact clearing where the last unbroken monarchy on the island came to an end at the hands of the men sworn to defend it. Sri Lankans today do not agree entirely on how to remember him. For much of the 20th century, colonial-era histories, many of them written or influenced by the same administrative tradition that had deposed him, portrayed Sri Vikrama Rajasinghe largely as a cruel and erratic tyrant whose own excesses brought the kingdom down, a framing that conveniently absolved the chiefs who handed him over and the colonial power that benefited from it. More recent Sri Lankan scholarship has pushed back against that portrait, without erasing the real brutality of his later reign, arguing that a young foreign-born king caught between an entrenched aristocracy determined to rule through him and a colonial power patiently waiting for exactly the kind of internal collapse his chiefs eventually engineered was never given much of a chance to succeed in the first place. Both readings can be true at once. He punished his enemies savagely, and he was also, in the end, betrayed by the very institution whose job it was to advise rather than replace him. The lake in Kandy that bears witness to his reign is one of the most photographed landmarks on the island today, and relatively few of the visitors who walk along its edge each year know the name of the king who ordered it dug, or where, in the end, his own life quietly ran out. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.